Anyway.
It's not the same one. It's not the same one. I repeat, it's not. Okay. That's what happened.
There was some naked bitch that was about to chase me. Okay, this is where I am. So
Oh wait, there's a lot of shit here.
yeah, so you have to turn these, look, and then the tile turns on.
If you become a better person, then you start to be good for things, you know? You can fix problems.
Happiness, we talk a lot about it. Should it be our life goal? And if not, what should we be seeking?
Well, it shouldn't be our life goal. Because there are times in your life when you're not going to be happy. And then what are you going to do? Your goal is demolished. And there are going to be plenty of times in your life when you're not happy. There might be years. And so it's a shallow boat in a very rough ocean. And it's based upon a misconceptualization. Happiness is something that descends upon you. Everyone knows that. You know, it comes upon you suddenly. And then you should be grateful for it because there's plenty of suffering. And if you happen to be happy, well, wonderful. Enjoy it. Be grateful for it. And maybe try to meditate on the reasons that it manifested itself, right? Because it can come as a mystery, you know? You don't necessarily know when you're going to be happy. Something surprising happens and delights you. And you can analyze that. You can think, well, I'm doing something right. I'm in the right place right now. I've done something right. Maybe I can hang on to that. Maybe I can learn from that. What you should be pursuing instead is, well, there's two things. You should be pursuing who you could be. That'd be the first thing. It's like, because you're not who you could be, and you know it. You have guilt and shame and regret, and you berate yourself for your lack of discipline and your procrastination and all your bad habits. You know perfectly well that you're not who you could be. And God only knows who you could be. And so that's how you should be that's what you should be striving for. And associated with that, you should be attempting to formulate some conception of the highest good that you can conceive of, that you can articulate. Because why not aim for that? It's like your life is short and it's troublesome. And perhaps you need to do something worthwhile with it. And if so, then you should do the most worthwhile thing. And you should figure out what that is for you. And part of that's definitely going to be to develop your character as much as possible, to dispense with those parts of you that are unworthy. And then maybe, if you're fortunate and you do that carefully, then happiness will descend upon you from time to time. And that's the best you've got. And then also perhaps during sorrowful times, or worse, evil times, the fact that you've strengthened your character and that you're aiming at the highest that you can conceptualize, that'll give you the moral fortitude to endure without becoming corrupted during those times. Be someone who can be relied upon in a crisis. There's an aim. You know, one of the things I've told my audience is, the young guys take to this a lot. I said, you should be the strongest person at your father's funeral, right? Well, that's something to aim for. It's a transition, a generational transition, and it means that, well,
Why'd they keep an altered item here?
all the people around you are suffering because of their loss. They have someone to turn to who can illustrate by their behavior that the force of character is sufficient to move
Debrief
you
for Mirror
beyond the
Excursion 7C.
catastrophe.
Subject
And
is Agent
you need
Hardy.
that. And that's a
Brief
great
for
thing
Mirror
to,
Excursions.
that's a great thing to hypothesize as your aim.
3 hours in the mirror.
Happiness
The
just
longest time on
evaporates
record.
as
Can you describe your experience
irrelevant
inside Agent Hardy?
in light of that sort of conceptualization.
So when you are the strongest person at your father's funeral, and I just burned it up,
Yeah.
it strikes home when you say that. Should there be joy around that realization? Not happiness. Happiness is like the fizzly bubbles in a carbonated beverage. Flighty, they tickle your tongue, but they go away. Is there a deeper joy? There's so many...
Well, there's
Calm down,
at least
Agent.
the sense that you've taken
It could be
something that could
psychosomatic, but
be
the
very
fact
much
that this
like
only
hell and
occurred
made it
after
far
returning
better than
from
it
the
could have
mirror
been.
takes a
And there's
paranatural
also the fact that you can deal with,
I recommend a battery of
if you've
tests
matured
and a
enough,
class
let's say,
orange wine.
to deal with the catastrophe of loss and death. And you can also be the rallying point for the remnants of your family and pull them together at a moment of crisis. And that's a payoff to some degree for the loss. And I mean, I've seen this in families who've dealt with death properly. The remainder of the family pulls together, you know, they become more integrated. And it's not complete compensation for their loss, but it's not nothing. And it certainly beats the alternative, where everyone fractionates because everyone's too weak to cope with the catastrophe and everything dissolves.
So how do you actually become the strongest person at your father's funeral? What are the steps? And is it always about being mission driven?
Well, the mission is the improvement of your character, the constant improvement of your character. And I think a lot of that's done in dialogue with your conscience. It's like your conscience is always telling you. Socrates said this thousands of years ago. Your conscience is always telling you what you shouldn't be doing. And one of the things Socrates said was what discriminated him from the run-of-the-mill person, and why perhaps we still know of him so many thousands of years later, was that when his conscience told him not to do something, he didn't do it. He stopped saying the things that he shouldn't have been saying, and he stopped doing the things he shouldn't have been doing. And that's a start, you know. That's a discipline, I would say. That's the ability to follow a certain kind of intrinsic discipline. And maybe that's merely the cessation of evil. That's not exactly the same as the pursuit of positive good. Let's say you haven't got there yet, but that's a start. You clear away the obstacles from your vision by ceasing to engage in those activities you know to be wrong. And then the world starts to lay itself out in more pristine form. And then maybe you can start to apprehend
Looks like there's a
what
mirror
would
in
be
there.
positively good instead of merely not wrong. I mean, not wrong is a good start. You know, the biblical corpus is structured in that way to some degree, at least from a Christian reading. The first rule is follow the damn rules, right? Get yourself together. Here's some rules, 10 of them, 100 of them. Follow them. You discipline yourself, right? You make yourself a reasonably morally respectable individual. And so now you're not blinded by your own proclivity, uselessness, and malevolence. And then you can integrate all that. You can integrate all those rules. And that's the beginning of the development of character. And then you can embody the union of the rules. It's something like that. And that's that ultimate nobility and character. Like in the Christian corpus, Christ is represented, let's think about this psychologically, as the perfect individual, right? But just think about that as the psychological representation. And that's the person who's taken a disciplinary structure and integrated it into a personality that acts that out properly in the world. And it's not merely rule-bound either, because you have to follow the rules, but you also have to be part of the process that generates new rules when it's necessary. And so you take that onto yourself, too, as an additional responsibility. You know, that makes you more than a blind avatar of authority and stops you from being rigid. And, you know, if you look at a medieval cathedral, one of the things you'll see, for example, is a representation of the sky, the dome of the sky. Maybe you'll see a representation of Christ on the peak of the dome. And think about that as a representation of the ideal individual, speaking only psychologically. It's like there's something of cosmic importance about that. That's what you're aiming at, is that perfection of yourself, and that'll keep you busy for your entire life. And it'll do no harm, right? It'll make you better. It'll make your family better. It'll make your community better, and it'll give you, and it's psychologically meaningful. So there's all that. It helps you withstand suffering and disperse malevolence. But it's also extraordinarily practical, because if you become a better person, then you start to be good for things. You know, you can fix problems. You can handle a funeral. You can handle a difficult situation. You know, and so it's not only that it's psychologically meaningful to pursue the highest of goals and the development of your character, but it's also the best possible thing that you can do practically here and now in the material world to make it less terrible than it might otherwise be.
Are your personal goals always going to be aligned with the needs of society, the needs of humanity?
Well, that's a trick. You know, it's optimally the answer is yes. And you can think about it like a musical score. You know how there's levels in a musical score. Each instrument is doing its own thing. Each section is doing its own thing. It's all united into a single vision. And that's the right...
What am I missing?
This is another reason why critics of the hierarchical structure are wrong, because the proper way to set up a hierarchy is so that your interests are aligned with those of your family. That's hard. That requires a lot of negotiation. And then you and your family have your interests aligned with those of your local community, right? So that all of those levels are reinforcing each other. And then those are united at the higher level, at a higher political structure. And that's an equilibrated state, to use a phrase from the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget. It's a game that everyone wants to play. And it's working for everyone at the same time. And so it isn't based on oppression or dominance from the top down. And so I think that if you formulate your character properly and you put yourself together, you start also to realize that you're not... Look, if you get married to someone, the idea is that you become one, right? And so it isn't just your interest anymore. Or maybe it's that your interest isn't your interest without it also being someone else's interest, right? It's insufficiently formulated. And you need that conflict with that other person to tap you into proper shape. So what you're aiming at is you and the development of your character, but more than that. And then you do the same when you introduce children into that. You expand out that characterological capacity. And then you can continue to expand that. And so optimally, yes, what serves you should be serving at every level. And I believe that part of the reason that music has such an overwhelming effect on people is because that's what it says. It says, look, everything can work in a multi-level harmony. And then people listen to music and, like, music produces a religious-like experience in everyone, right? It transfixes them with the sense of intrinsic meaning. It's really miraculous that it does that. And the question is why? And I've puzzled over this for years. And it seems to me that the reason is that in a musical piece, everything has its proper place at every level. And so that speaks of, well, it speaks of heaven. That's the right way to put it, which is why music is so often used in churches. But it means that everyone's interests are being taken into account. You know, and it's a utopian ideal, and it's something that has to be constantly worked on. But see, people often have accused me of an individualistic bias in my moral reasoning, you know, that, well, you should get yourself together. It's like Ayn Rand. It's like, no, it's not it. You get yourself together so that you can get your family together, so you can get your community together, so that you can get the world together. All of that at the same time. There's nothing selfish about that, except the responsibility, which is on you, to start that. and to bear that and to lift that and to act it out. So it has nothing to do with chasing your short-term, impulsive, pleasure-seeking goals.
Which is the real epiphany for me, because you'll know that you're doing the right thing for your personal growth when it's the same thing that society needs from you. When your needs align with what society needs you to do for it, then you're doing the right thing probably for yourself.
Well, that's how it seems. I mean, it seems then like you found your niche, right? It's where you and what you have to offer fit. And, you know, I think of people as beasts of burden in some sense. Like we're built for a burden. And we're not happy without that burden. And we want to find the one that suits us. And that's difficult. It's part of the adventure of life to seek out the burden that suits you. But when you have that, then yes, then hopefully you're operating in harmony with the requirements of those around you. And the thing to me is that everything else pales in comparison to that. That's why it says in the New Testament that you should stack up riches in heaven. It's like there isn't anything better than that. You know, you're functioning well, your family's functioning well, you're contributing to your community. What you're doing is worthwhile, you know. You're not tormented by your conscience. You're aiming at something that the sacrifices that you have to make that clearly justify the sacrifices you have to make. Maybe even the sacrifice of your life, because you're in this, like this is a mortal game. You're in this with your whole life. And you'd think that what that would mean, at least in part, is that you need to find a game to play that's of sufficient grandeur and nobility so that perhaps even the fact that mortality is built into the structure now becomes justifiable. I mean, it's a hell of an ambition, but it doesn't seem to me to be something that's impossible. I think you can live your life enough so that it justifies itself despite its limitation. That's the real question. Can you do that? And I believe that you can, and I believe that what that means is that the human spirit fundamentally triumphs over death. And so that's optimism, you know, in the midst of the sorrow and the malevolence. We have the capacity. We have the capacity to transcend that. And there isn't anything more optimistic than that. And there's nothing in it that isn't good. Right? It's good for you. It's good for the people you love. It's good for the broader society. It's like it's good. And that'll take you through your times of travail. There isn't anything else that will. And then maybe on your deathbed you can think, I justified the privilege, the terrible privilege of my existence. And maybe that's good enough. It's possible that that's good enough. You certainly don't have anything better to do than that, as far as I can tell.
We all got to find our burden. Dr. Peterson, I appreciate your passion for this. It sinks through, and it's music, as you poetically describe, the things we all struggle with day in and day out. Put words to emotions most of us can't even touch. Thank you, Leland. He's undeniably one of the greatest intellectual phenomenons of our generation. Dr. Jordan Peterson's work as a clinical psychology professor at the University of Toronto has catapulted him to international fame with arguments that are challenging and changing the way we all think. He has captured the attention of millions, especially of young men, but some young women as well. And many of you, however, have never heard of him, but you will get to know him for the first time through this interview. Today, he is here, breaking down his provocative rules for life and the prescription for success that will surprise many of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation.
So it is an interesting group of insights that you offer us, and I can enter it in many ways, but let me just start with, for me, perhaps the most obvious, which is, what is it that you say that's resonating with so many people? What itch are you scratching?
I think there's probably two. We had a long conversation in our culture in the necessity for self-esteem and happiness. And that's not what I'm talking about. I tell my audiences and my readers very straightforwardly that life is difficult, there's a lot of suffering in it, and that you have to learn how to conduct yourself in the face of that. The problem with the pursuit of happiness is that when life's storms come along, happiness disappears, and then you're left with nothing. And so you need to pursue something that's deeper than happiness. And if happiness comes along, well then, hooray for you. You don't want to despise it because it's fleeting, but it's much better to pursue things that are meaningful than things that make you happy. It's deeper, and it orients you more appropriately, and it keeps you centered in your own life. It makes you more useful for your family and your community. So that's one thing. And it's a relief to young people to know that the baseline conditions of life are difficult, but that you can still prevail. So it's a funny message in some sense, or a strange message, because on the one hand it's somewhat pessimistic. Now I talk about suffering and malevolence also, but I also emphasize the fact that despite that being the base conditions of existence, people are tough enough to prevail. So that's one element of it. The other element is the necessity of responsibility. So a lot of what people find in life that
Looks like there's a
provides them
mirror
with
in
a
there.
sustaining meaning is a consequence of not the pursuit of rights or the pursuit of happiness or the development of self-esteem, but the adoption of responsibility. And the more responsibility, in some sense, the better. Responsibility for yourself, for making sure that your life lays itself out like it should, responsibility for your family, responsibility for the community. It's people who take responsibility that are the ones that you admire, and that's the right pathway through life. That's where meaning is to be found. And I think that's probably the crucial issue, is that identification of a profound relationship between responsibility and meaning. And for many of the people that I'm talking with, it seems like that's the first time that that's been articulated.
The
for them.
shutters in the image look
So
different.
speaking about responsibility and meaning and how to make sense of a world where so many people feel isolated, I'll
What
come
am
back
I
to that.
missing?
That seems so helpful. And yet you've been a lightning rod in many ways, with a lot of harsh comments, especially in the print media. What is it that your critics are arguing?
Debrief for
Well, I
your
got embroiled in
excursion
some
7C.
political dispute, I would say,
Objectives,
in
Agent
my home
Hardy.
front in Canada when
Hardy
our
spent
government introduced some
approximately 3
legislation that
hours in the
purported to be
America.
about
The
compassion,
longest time on record.
but which to my
Can you
way of
describe your
thinking was about
experience inside Agent
compulsion
Hardy?
with regards to speech. And so that's tangled me up. But I also think that people aren't necessarily that happy with a message of personal responsibility when they're really interested in the mechanics of social change. Now, my sense is that, well, life is unfair. Social structures are unfair. The arbitrary way that illness is distributed into the population is unfair. But despite that, the best level of analysis for rectifying that in a practical sense, but also in a psychological sense, is the level of the individual. And so people who think in a collectivist manner, or people who are playing identity politics games that insist that your group identity should be your hallmark, don't like what I have to say at all. And they have their reasons. I'm not a fan of identity politics types. I think it's a very, very dangerous game, particularly because it makes us tribal. And tribal people are very dangerous. You know, as we degenerate into our tribal groups, the probability of violence increases as far as I'm concerned. That's what the anthropological data would suggest as well. So the collectivist types don't like me very much.
You're clinical psychology. I mean, it's a challenging profession. You chose it coming out of a rural town in central Canada. How did that advance your life journey? What in your life has inspired you to do what you do now? And especially to take some of the public steps now that are drawing criticism to you, which is always painful.
What a weird way to lock
Well,
something up.
I've always been obsessed with totalitarianism and authoritarian governments, whether they're on the right or the left. And for years, decades really, I spent almost all of my free time thinking about what happened in Nazi Germany and in Russia during the Soviet era, but also in Maoist China. There were other places as well. Trying to understand how it was that we could have got off the rails so absolutely terribly. And
Wait, that didn't
I
sound
started
right.
studying that at the collectivist level, I would say, looking for political reasons or economic
Yeah, that's
reasons.
not good.
But as I investigated further, those levels of analysis became increasingly, they weren't providing the answers that I wanted. I think partly because I was really interested in the notion that there's something to learn from what happened, say, in Nazi Germany. But there's something to learn at an individual level. That's my estimation. I don't think that there were innocent masses of people led astray by a single malevolent leader. I don't think the fundamental motivations for what happened in Nazi Germany were economic. And I don't think they were in the Soviet Union either. As I read more and more about the situations, I realized that the proclivity of individuals to avoid responsibility and to lie, especially about their own lives and about their own experience, were really the reasons that those systems went so far astray. Now, there were other reasons as well, but those were very important to me because I also thought that the proper lesson in the aftermath of something like Auschwitz is how do I ensure that I live a life such that if I was offered the opportunity to do something terrible by omission or by commission, that I wouldn't do it, that I would have enough strength of character to resist. And so the lessons there for me were psychological. And that taught me an awful lot about, well, the role of the individual. People like Viktor Frankl, for example, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, which is a perennial classic and a great book, insisted that a large part of the reason that Germany went off the rails so badly was because individual Germans were so willing to falsify their own experience. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, the best document on what happened in the Soviet Union, also made exactly the same argument. So I got interested in the psychological causes of catastrophic governance, let's say. And that taught me a lot. It taught me about responsibility, about the responsibility of the sovereign individual. And you know, we have an idea in our culture, it's a very powerful idea, that each of us is of intrinsic value, but that associated with that value is a responsibility. And we have a responsibility, let's say, for our own integrity and for that of our families, but also of the state, because otherwise we wouldn't have the sovereign responsibility and right to vote. Like our whole culture is predicated on the idea that each of us are sufficiently significant so that we can entrust the destiny of the state itself to our decisions. It's like, well, I believe that, and I think that that's a correct idea, which is also why I think that systems that are based on that idea function so well, like our Western systems do. But that's a responsibility that has to be taken with dead seriousness, because it means that the good things that you do in your life are truly good and they matter. They ripple outward way more than you think. But so do the things you do that aren't good, including the acts of deception that you engage in, perhaps above all else, which would include your willingness to evade responsibility or to push it off to someone else, or to play the short term against the long term. And so, well,
let me unwrap this a little bit, because you're touching on a bunch of things, and I think they would all benefit us. So, first of all, I appreciate that you actually put some of your thoughts down into two books that I've read. The latter is a best-selling book right now. It's like number 4 selling book in the country, 12 Rules for Life, Antidote to Chaos. And I am curious how you put that all together. And let's start off with the basic, which is, what's it all about? What's the goal of life? According to some of the more recent pieces you've been writing.
I would say that the goal in life is to conduct yourself so that life improves, at least so that undue suffering is forestalled. But more than that, so it's to constrain malevolence and suffering to the degree that that's possible. But then also to work for a positive improvement in things at every level, and that's how you should orient yourself.
So I saw something you wrote. Actually, it's in the book in part as well. Is to repeat actions that are worthy.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
which
noble
is sort of
and worthy. That would
noble
be
and worthy. Yes, right. So you sort of figure out what you should do and then just do it, which I think that's an achievable goal. Most people would think that's laudatory. That takes me to the next part, which is, what's the meaning of life? And
I think the meaning is to be found in that, and as you put things together, and as you take responsibility for things, that meaning emerges from that. And so it emerges from that the same way it emerges from a symphony, in some sense, because a symphony is composed of layers of patterns, and they're all working harmoniously together. And they speak directly to people of meaning, which is why people love music so much. I mean, every form of music does that. And it's a model for proper being, which is the placing of all the different levels of reality into harmonious relationship with one another. And meaning emerges out of that naturally. And meaning is actually an instinct. This is another thing that people don't understand, and it's a case I've been able to make, because I I know a fair bit about how the brain works. The twin hemispheres of your brain interact to guide you through life, which is a truism in some sense. You use your brain to guide you through life, but your brain does that fundamentally by instilling the proper things that you do with a sense of meaning. And that meaning it's not something that's just a surface, it's not on the surface of the world in some sense. It's the deepest instinct that you have. It's associated with a phenomenon that Russian neuropsychologists discovered back in the 1960s called the orienting reflex. And the orienting reflex is what orients you towards things of interest. Right. And that happens unconsciously. And so if something happens around you that's of significance, often something you don't expect, say something somewhat chaotic, you'll orient towards it and that attracts your attention. And then as you investigate what that is, that's associated with a sense of meaning. And if you put what you're investigating into proper order, then that meaning continues to reveal itself. So you can use meaning as a guide to proper being. But you have to also be very careful to conduct yourself honestly if you're going to do that. Because if you conduct yourself dishonestly, you pathologize the mechanisms that orient you.
So I'm thinking about in my own life how I've tried to apply some of these insights. If I just try to be a little bit better today than I was yesterday, along the lines that you're speaking to, try to create that symphony, but be a little better at it today than yesterday. And like everybody watching right now, not compare myself to somebody else, but rather to compare myself to the future version of me. Is that a rational way?
Rule. That's rule 4, right?
It's rule 4.
Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. Well, it's not only appropriate, but I think it's also practical. And one of the things about what I do, including my book, is that I'm always trying to take high-level abstract truths, fundamental truths, and to make them concrete and practical so that you can implement them in your day-to-day life. Because it's the connection between those abstractions and practical action that really cements their meaning and makes them comprehensible. And this idea of incremental improvement is a great one. If there are things about your life that are bothering you, things about the world that are bothering you, then you want to decompose them into solvable sub-problems. And you do this, if you have a child, this is the sort of thing that you do naturally, right? Because you want to set your child a challenge that's sufficiently challenging to push them forward in their development. So that makes it meaningful for the child. That puts them in the zone of proximal development, which is where proper maturation takes place. They'll find that intrinsically meaningful. You want to make it challenging, but also with a reasonable probability of success. And there's an art to that. So you want to set yourself a task that's difficult, but not so difficult you can't attain it. And then what happens is that you step up improvement across time, incrementally. And there's also a certain element of humility to it, right? Which is, don't bite off more than you can chew, right? Don't set grandiose goals, but incremental improvement will get you a tremendous distance.
When you don't do that perfectly, and it's not easy to do, you suffer. And I've on this stage often said that pain is inevitable. You're going to have pain. How much suffering comes in that pain, you actually have a fair amount of control over. Can't make it go away, to your point. It's part of life. Your thoughts around suffering that you began to touch on have been incredibly provocative for a lot of people, widely debated. I think in part because in our modern world, we don't like to acknowledge that kind of suffering can afflict us. We think something's wrong with us if we have that kind of suffering. So how is it productive to focus on suffering the way you do?
Well, there is something wrong with us if we're suffering. There's something wrong with the world. It's an indication that things aren't set in the order that hypothetically could be set. There's actually something that's a call to action. It's a painful call to action. But it's a universal problem. Suffering is built into the structure of existence. In fact, suffering doesn't mean that there's something isolated that's at fault. This is why the doctrine of universal sin is actually quite useful, because everyone makes mistakes. Everyone falls short of the glory of God.
It's original sin, if you don't mind. And this is again, with all the monotheistic religions, but it exists in other religions as well.
Well, it's a way of universalizing everyone's felt sense that they don't live up to their responsibility properly, because you're not all you could be. And unless you understand that that's everyone's problem, every single person has that issue, then it's easy to become discouraged and crushed by that. And the major advantage, I think, to making a case very strongly that one of the fundamental realities of life is its suffering, is that it's actually a relief to people to hear that because they suspect it. Well, they know it. But no one's forthright about it. It's like, yeah, life is suffering. Okay, fine. So where does that leave us? Well, here's where it leaves us. It turns out that even though life is suffering, if you're sufficiently courageous and forthright and honest, let's say, in your approach, and you don't shy away, what you'll find is that there's something within you that will respond to the challenge of suffering with the development of ability that will transcend the suffering. So the pessimism is, yeah, well, life is rife with problems at every level. But the upside is, if you turn and confront that voluntarily, that you'll find something in yourself that can develop and master that. And so the optimism is nested in the pessimism. And that's extremely helpful to people, especially people who are struggling, because they think, oh my God, life is so difficult. I don't know if I can stand this. There must be something wrong with me. Does anybody else feel this way? And you can say, yes, everyone feels that way at some point. But that's, and it is as bad as you think, but you're more than you think you are. You're more than you think you are. And what I really like about this too is it's very much in keeping with the clinical data. So for example, what you do as a clinician, as a clinical psychologist, as a psychiatrist, as any mental health professional who's well trained, if people are afraid of something that's standing in your way, like maybe you're afraid to develop your career, maybe you're afraid of public speaking. Well, I could try to calm you down about your fear and protect you from the challenge that would be associated with public speaking. You say, well, you never have to do that. Or I could say, no, look, you have to learn to present yourself more effectively in public if you're going to develop your career. And you're afraid of it. So let's break down what you're afraid of into 10 steps or 20 steps until we can find a step that's small enough so that you can actually master it. And let's assume that with 3 years of diligent practice that you could become a competent public speaker, at least one that isn't terrified. And with 5 years you could become an expert. And let's decide how relevant that is to your future prosperity and thriving. And then let's assume that if you break it down properly and take it on step by step in this incremental way that we discussed, that you'll actually master every single bit of it. And the thing that's cool about that is all the clinical evidence shows it works. And not only that, that's actually how you learn in life. Like when you bring a child to the playground and the child is apprehensive about making new friends, you say, okay, well, look, kiddo, stick around me for a minute or two and just watch what's going on. It's like, and the child will calm down. You say, okay, now go 5 feet away. Just go out there a little bit and just see how it goes. And stay out there as long as you can. And if you need to come back for a hug, then no problem. It's like, so then the child can go out 10 feet. And they come back. You say, okay, well now, maybe just go over there and watch those kids. And the child will go out and then come back. And so that's it. It's the child's going out to where they're afraid, seeing that they can master it, and then coming back.
So this seems so self-evident that I'm left wondering, well, did people know this 100 years ago? This issue of taking responsibility, which I think is part of the pain that people feel, because it's not something we expect a lot. And people don't realize that it seems to help a lot in most scenarios, if you sort of own it, because you control your destiny. So there's this wisdom we had and forgot. You spoke about original sin. These are stories that are thousands of years old, Adam and Eve, right? These are constructs that are archetypal to us, are fundamental to who our species is, and somehow it seems to have slipped from us.
Well, knowledge is coded in different ways, eh? So a good example, someone who's a good example acts out for you how you should be. And a good story portrays that dramatically. But an articulated representation tells you exactly why and explains it. And so some of this needs to be more articulated than it has been, because we've become detached in some sense from our underlying examples and our stories, partly because they've been criticized so much. But I think we're at a point where developing this more articulated knowledge is necessary.
But just so I make sure everyone's clear on this, what I'm taking away is it's a balancing act between the rights you deserve and the responsibility that you must take. And if that balance is off in society, and we do seem to focus a lot on people's rights, which is instinctive to who we are, but we often don't match it up with the responsibility that comes along with that.
Which is exactly why I think that what I'm talking about is falling on receptive ears, is because you actually cannot have a prolonged discussion of rights without having an equally prolonged discussion of responsibility for a variety of reasons. First of all, the actual reason that you have rights is so that you can discharge your responsibilities. It's not the other way around. It's like you're granted rights by everyone around you, or It's part of the purpose of exercise in some sense is so that you can be given an autonomous space that's protected, in which you can manifest what's necessary about you in the world that's contribution to you. So I have to leave a space for you so that you can make your contribution for yourself, so you can shoulder responsibility for your family, so that you can serve the community the best way that you can. And I don't want to set up a society that will interfere with that. But then there's this issue of responsibility and meaning, which is absolutely crucial. And so the responsibility element is more important than the meaning element, as far as I'm concerned. It certainly is at this point in time. And people know this. They instinctively know it.
And yet, the role of addiction seems, which is a painful role to have, because something bad happened to you. But it's something that society struggles with. But what about people who feel like they're a victim?
They're right. The victimizers too. Like everybody is a strange mixture of victim and victimizer. Lots of terrible things happen to people that aren't justifiable in some sense. Illness strikes people randomly. I mean, not entirely randomly, obviously, but there's a large random element in it, where you're thrown into existence as a consequence of your birth. That's existential. That all the time. We're talking about it as thrownness. You're sort of thrown into reality with your particular set of predispositions and weaknesses. And then there's going to be times in your life where things twist in a manner that's unfair to you, that you're not getting your just desserts. But that goes along with all sorts of unequally distributed privileges as well. And so that's the arbitrary nature of existence. But you can't allow those sorts of things to define you, because it's not that useful strategically. When you're playing a card game, you're dealt a hand of cards.
Yep.
Well, what do? You play the hand the best you can. Why? Because all the hands are equal? No. Because you don't have a better strategy than playing the hand that you're dealt the best you can. And that doesn't even mean it'll be a winning strategy. But because people don't always win, sometimes we lose, and sometimes we lose painfully, and sometimes we lose painfully and unjustly. That's not the point. The point is you don't have a better strategy, neither does anyone else. And then it's also not so obvious how privilege and victimization are distributed. If you take someone who's doing quite well in life, and you scratch around the surface, you really don't have to scratch very far until you find one or more profound tragedies of the past and perhaps of the present. No matter how well protected you are in the world, you're still subject to the dissolution of your relationships, the death of your dreams, death itself. So vulnerability is built into existence. Now, if you start to regard yourself as a hapless victim, or even worse, an unfairly victimized victim, well, then things can turn that sideways. It's not good strategy. You end up resentful, you end up angry, you end up vengeful, you end up hostile. And that's just the beginning. Things can get far more out of hand than that. So strategically, it's a bad game. It's better to take responsibility for the hand that you've been dealt. You've got no better protection in life than doing that.
This is where a lot of folks in modern life get upset. Because we have been brought up to believe that we need to be compassionate. And if you point out that sometimes that compassion, I don't know if it encourages weakness or it's another word for it. I'd love if you could open that up for me, because it is the kind of discussion that gets folks really unsettled.
Feeling sorry for someone is not a virtue. Morality is much more complex than merely reflexive empathy. So I would say, when is reflexive empathy useful? That's easy. You're a mother. Your child is under 6 months old. Reflexive empathy is the right reaction. And I think that's why it's such a powerful motivating force as well. A child under 6 months old is always right. A child's in distress, always right. You're wrong, the child's right. No matter why the child is distressed, It's your problem, and you should do something about it, and it's not the infant's fault. Okay, now, we have a very lengthy dependency period as human beings, and that means that infants...
30, 40 years for some.
Well, yeah, exactly. And so, because of that intense dependency, that empathic circuitry has to be very, very powerful. But it can easily be utilized in a domain that's outside of its proper purview. And unreflexive empathy is not a moral virtue. And just because you feel sorry for someone, you are not a good person. Now, that might be a subcomponent of being a good person, but it's very frequently the case that complex problems require sophisticated, complex planning, thinking, and analysis, which is why we invented science, for example, which is why we invented sophisticated social policy and all of that. And it's certainly not the case that everything that's good in the medium to long run looks so good in the short term. I mean, you think about when you're disciplining a child, which you have to do, because one of your responsibilities as a parent is to produce a child, help produce a child who is disciplined and who's socially acceptable to everyone else, which is your fundamental responsibility. Whenever you discipline a child, you cause short-term distress for the benefit of the medium to the long run. And that runs contrary to reflexive empathy. You need more than empathy to get by in the world. So it's unsophisticated thinking to assume that, first of all, that reflexive empathy towards those who are hypothetically unfairly victimized constitutes a moral virtue. It's not that simple, and it can be very, very dangerous because you can undermine people by inappropriately feeling sorry for them. It's not helpful.
So, as I was listening to a bunch of the different talks that you've given, I was caught off guard by a comment you made in a series on the bottom. And this is an important issue because a lot of folks believe the need to find therapy and have a belief that it is the need to go to therapy. Certainly what I thought. And you stunned me by arguing that words wouldn't mean what we thought of.
I looked at a bunch of different translations. Yeah, and my conclusion was, well, words get translated multiple times and they shift their meaning across time. And so each study. My those who have swords that's a much better idea as far as I'm concerned. To be strong and dangerous. But to harness that, use it in the service of the good. So it's associated with the complex ideas.
But that principle right there is a stark differentiator from much of the material that I read. It's clearly about the fact that usually a victim is a lot of folks do feel sorry for others. Usually behind that is, I'll do something.
Not that easy. That's the problem. You wouldn't have to think to guide this problem. It doesn't. It guides us properly in some very specific conditions. It can also make us very dangerous because there's good experimental literature on this. If you're very sensitive to an in-group's claims, whatever they might be, that makes you very hostile to perceived out-group members.
In-group out-group people within your tribe.
Yeah, well, we're within whatever group it is at that moment. So empathy drives that in-group identification. Oh, those are predators. You better be hard on them. It's a mother bear's compassion that gets you eaten. So we can't be thinking that empathy is an internal good. There's no evidence for that. There's no psychoanalysis as well. Parent, mother was a more general approach, and that's someone who will do absolutely everything for you all the time, so that you never have to rely on yourself. That's not good. There's rules. You're dealing with the elderly and old folks. Here's a rule: never do anything for one of your parents they can do themselves. Why? Because they're already struggling with the loss of their independence. And you want to help them maintain their independence as long as possible. And that might mean sitting by while someone struggles to do up their buttons. And look at this. Then if you're maybe helping your 3-year-old dress themselves. It's like, yeah, you can put on the buttons a lot faster. Let me help you with that. It's like, no, you struggle with that. You master it. And I'll keep my empathy to myself. Thank you very much. So that I can help you maintain your independence.
Let's put it in Mother's Little Mermaid.
Yes.
So these motifs still speaking to our culture.
Sure, well, you see this as well. The Prince Lachlan's plans to Lachlan based fundamentally is useless. Right? And she's the force that stops him from making an alliance with the young woman and having his life. I just think that what it does destroy. The good mother necessarily fails. Right? Because as your child emerges, as your child develops, you're a perfect mother until 6 months. You take care of your child's every need. Okay, well, at somewhere between 6 and 9 months, the child starts to develop. Autonomous, starts to be able to do little things on his or her own. You back off. Every time the child steps forward, you step backwards. And maybe you step backwards a little faster even to motivate your child to step forward. And then what you say is, it isn't you I care about, it's who you could be. And so that's another thing that I'm talking to young men and women about. It isn't you I care about, it's who you could be. Well, that's really hard. Not when you talk to 18. They have their whole life ahead. Whose side should you be on? The 18-year-old kid who's 18-year-old kid where you are. No, you're not. You're not even close to it. You haven't even started. You're not who you could be physically. You're not who you could be spiritually. You're not educated to the degree you could be. You could really be something, man. You've got 60 years to work on it. Get the hell out. That's way better. That's a way more positive message, even though it's got that strange harshness about it, because it's judgmental. Every ideal is a judge. You can't get away with it. You can't get away from it, right? Or with it. You put something up as an ideal that it stares down at you and says, you are not what you could be. Every great piece of art does that. And to tell young people, it's like, no, you're not okay the way you are. That's why we have universities. That's why we have training programs. It's like you don't know enough to go out there and change the world. You're not out there waving placards around and telling people how to behave. Get your act together. Learn some skills. Educate yourself. Learn how to speak. Learn how to conduct yourself. Learn how to stand up. Make yourself a force in the world. There's way more to you than you think.
You appreciate why that message would resonate with some but scare the heck out of others.
It should scare the heck out of everybody. You know, that's what they say. Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Like, there's real truth in that. And this is I think, and this is what scared me. I learned from studying Auschwitz and the terrible things that I studied for many, many years, that I was responsible for them. And I believe that. Yes, because it comes down to individual integrity. All of these things. If the state is corrupting around you, that's on you. It's your responsibility. You think, well, how can I take on that responsibility? It's like, be more than you are. So, and how could you not be afraid of that? Well, of course you'd want to shy away from that. But the alternative is far worse. It's far worse to let things degenerate. Like, you have a chance, you have the opportunity to contend with the structure of reality and to set things right. You can do that if you take it on voluntarily. And that's a terrible burden, to confront suffering and malevolence, especially given the degree of malevolence. It's a terrible thing to confront. The alternative is worse. Let things slide. You just see where you end up there. At least you have a fighting chance if you're a contender, right? You're in the ring, and you can do it. That's the thing. That's what makes me so fundamentally optimistic about people, is that the problems that confront us are almost infinite in their catastrophic consequence. But there's something within us that's even greater than that. And so that's the fundamental reality. You don't get to that either unless you start with what's so terrible. Say, life is rife with suffering and injustice, and we make it worse with our malevolence. It's terrible. Okay, well, that's horrible. Who can withstand that? It's like, yeah, well, if you look inside that, you see that something beckons, and what beckons is the possibility of what you could become if you confront that. And that's what we need to know. And that's, I think, integrally tied up with our most fundamental religious convictions. We know that people have an indomitable divine spirit. Well, how do you call that forth? Well, by challenging it. It's not going to come out without that. You're not going to be who you could be without pushing yourself to your limit. Because why would you be? It's not like it's easy. You have to be compelled in some sense. You have to be challenged. And that's why you do your children no favors by overprotecting them. Quite the contrary.
Why does that message make you so emotional? And what were you like at age 18? You're in Saskatchewan, I believe.
Alberta at that time, yeah. Well, I was thinking about the sorts of things that we're talking about now. I've been thinking about them ever since I can remember, but, I've got better at thinking about them across time. But I had a lot of the problems, I suppose, that the typical 18-year-old would have. I drank a lot. I come from this little town in northern Alberta. Heavy drinking. I started drinking when I was 14, so I was quite a partier. I was confused existentially, I would say. I wasn't sure what the proper direction in life was. I was very much obsessed with the problem of the Cold War. That's never really gone away, because that seemed to me to be just a kind of insanity that I didn't know how to fathom. And, it was all of that, and I was obsessed with reading and obsessed with learning, and so that was what all drove me in this direction. And then as I started to develop these ideas, like, I had to let go of things. One of the ideas that I've been promoting to people is that you have to let the dead wood burn off. And you do that as a consequence of necessity in the pursuit of responsibility. When I started writing seriously, I had to stop drinking because I couldn't think properly. So that was it. It was either like, you're going to do one of these or the other. You're either going to continue wasting your time. I was having a fine time. I was in graduate school and I had I was very, very social. And a lot of that involved drinking and that sort of thing. Couldn't do both. Especially when I was editing. I couldn't get my thoughts down pristinely enough, precisely enough. Plus the emotional magnitude of the things that I was dealing with were more overwhelming if I was, in the aftermath of a party. So I decided when I was like 25 or so to just stop.
I've been caught off guard by how politicized you've become. And as I read of your youth, I know that you had your run-ins with religion, which a lot of people do. You actually got politically active, but on the left, not the right. Help me understand what went down.
Well, in the little town I grew up in, the member of parliament, the provincial parliament, equivalent to American state, was a democratic socialist. He was the only one in the entire province. Everyone else was conservative, which would be sort of moderate Republican, I would say. And, there's something to be said for political voice for the working class and for the dispossessed. And it certainly is the case that the hierarchical structures that compose our society, do produce dispossession. They stack people up at the bottom. And so people at the bottom need to have a political voice. And so I was very attracted to that end of the political spectrum. But as I came to investigate some of the problems I've been discussing more deeply, I started to understand that mere economic rectification was insufficient, that wasn't the level of analysis that was appropriate for my inquiry anyways.
Translated, redistribution of income doesn't work.
Well, think about it this way. The guaranteed basic income idea. It's like, that's predicated on the idea that man lives by bread alone. Well, that isn't how it works, and I've certainly seen that in my clinical practice. I've had clients, especially addicts, if you gave them money, they would die. And the reason for that, like one guy that I remember in particular, I liked him quite a bit. He had a bad cocaine problem. And as long as he was flat broke, he wasn't dead. But as soon as he was on disability, as soon as his disability check came in, he was face down in the ditch 3 days later. So, and you think, maybe that's a consequence of his overwhelming poverty, etc. You could come up with some social reason for that path that he took, but it wasn't by any stretch of the imagination that simple. It's like people need purpose more than money even. I mean, obviously, we don't want people starving. And actually, we're doing a pretty good job of solving that problem worldwide. You know, the UN projects that there won't be anyone in absolute poverty by the year 2030, which is really quite the bloody miracle, that's for sure. So we're doing a pretty good job of getting rid of abject privation. But then it isn't the provision of material well-being with ease that allows people to live properly, even though a certain amount of material wealth is a necessary precondition. It's purpose. And that's a much more difficult problem to solve. It's like we need something to grapple with. We need a meaning to justify our lives. And some of that is to be found in, well, the struggle against privation and malevolence. The mere offering of material sustenance to people isn't going to solve the problem. Dostoevsky knew this 150 years ago. He said if you gave people everything they wanted, so all they had to do was eat cakes and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, the first thing they do is smash it all to hell so that something interesting could happen. He said that's our fatal flaw and salvation, both of that wanting to contend rather than to sit back and have everything taken care of.
So how do we get an 18-year-old to understand what Dostoevsky wrote 150 years ago? How do you get a 38 or a 58-year-old, which is my age, to understand how to take responsibility?
No, we have discussions like this. You know, and you make the case to people as well. So I've been touring around. My wife and I have gone to 60 cities now since January of this year. And I've been speaking to audiences that average 2,500 people. And I deliver a lecture that's very much like this conversation. It's like lay out the structure of life, the fact that it's rife with suffering and malevolence, that we erect hierarchies in an attempt to deal with that, to deal with those problems, because they're too alike, that the hierarchies dispossess people, and so we have to take care of the dispossessed as well, and to draw out the relationship between meaning and responsibility. And the audiences are
We used to play there all
rapt
the
as a
time.
consequence of that. You know, and I'm always listening to my audiences is when are they silent?
Other kids as well.
Because, you know,
Is
when
this
everyone in
what
an
Dylan
audience is
wanted me
silent,
to see?
then everyone's in the same place.
doesn't
That's a
matter.
meaningful
We
place.
need to find that
They're all
projector.
lined up, and they line up on this axis of responsibility and meaning.
Different.
So
All
there's a
the
hole in our
times I
culture
felt
where this
paranoid.
information hasn't
I
been
was
provided.
right.
But
the
it was
Bureau could
there
have given
at-
me
at
the
times in our
answers,
history,
but they
which has
just
been
stood by
The thing
and watched me.
that I struggle with is the issue of sacrifice. It's so paradoxical, right? Why would me giving of myself to you make me feel better? It does seem like most of the time if I have money, I give you some of my money, I have less money. But you're arguing that if I understand true sacrifice and I sacrifice myself for something that has meaning.
Well, part of it is, you know, human beings discovered time. That's one of the things that makes us very peculiar creatures. To be aware of our own mortality is a consequence of the discovery of time. Like, we can see how we extend into the future. And so that makes us very strange creatures, as selfish creatures. Because you actually can't be narrow and selfish and survive. And here's the reason. You have to take care of yourself now. So let's say, well, then you can pursue impulsive pleasure, perhaps at the expense of other people. And why not? Well, here's one reason why not. There isn't just you now. There's you tomorrow. There's you next week. There's you next month and next year and 10 years from now. And so if you conduct yourself in a manner in the present that interferes with your future selves, then that's a downhill trip for you. And so taking care of yourself in the future and taking care of other people actually turns out to be exactly the same thing. Because you're actually a community of people that's distributed across the earth. And so if you act in your own best interest, then you're going to sacrifice some of the present for the future. And that was one of the great discoveries of mankind, right? Which is something that I also concentrate on in 12 Rules, because I'm really interested in the issue of sacrifice. Why would you give up something now? Why would you ever give up something now voluntarily? The answer is sometimes if you give up something now, it's often something you love, something you're very in love with even, perhaps not for the best reasons, then you can make a bargain with the future. And that bargain with the future isn't any different than the bargain you make with other people. So that narrow selfishness is blindness to time and context. And there's nothing about it that's great. And I do think the musical example is a really good one. Like in a musical piece, every note has to fit with every other note across the entire span of the piece. Well, that's what your life needs to be like. It's like how you act with me right now has to be in harmony with what you want for yourself tomorrow. And that's going to be tangled in as well. It's not only that you repeat across time and have to take that into account, it's that you repeat across time in the context of your social life. And so all of that has to be brought into the equation. And the sacrificial motif is a huge part of that. And then that also is something that runs contrary in some sense to empathy, because sometimes you have to, you have to beat yourself on the back of the head with a stick to get yourself to move forward properly, even though you know, I should be doing it, I should be doing it. No sympathy for that. You have to do it, because otherwise things are going to get worse.
I heard you say that you're quoting one of the Ten Commandments, saying, do unto your neighbors as you have them do unto you. The word nice is not in there.
No, well, nice isn't enough. And this...
Is it not enough, or is it not the right thing to expect? Because so many members of my audience beat themselves up in a way they would never
I studied
hurt
what
others.
yes,
happened
that's
in
definitely-
And
ordinary
they say
here.
they're thinking, but
That's
most
the
thinking
place to
is
start looking.
self-flagellation.
Oh,
So
yes,
part of it
definitely.
is take it easy on yourself, be
Yes.
fair. On the other hand, sometimes you tolerate stuff from other people because you teach people how to think. And you do that, you get it.
Getting that balance is really hard. So treat yourself like you're someone responsible for helping. And that I was really interested in that issue of people mistreating themselves. So because we are privy to our own weaknesses and faults. We know them better than anyone else knows them. And so it's very easy for us to determine that we're not worthwhile because of all the ways that we don't live up to what we should live up to, and the painful knowledge we have of that, and to not regard ourselves as worthwhile, and to not treat ourselves properly. And that's not good. You have to treat yourself as if you're valuable. And then that is the same attitude that you extend to other people. Well, and it's because you are valuable. So, and that it's a necessity to adopt the responsibility that goes along with recognizing that. So even if you're not happy with who you are, and even if you have your reasons, you still deserve presumption of innocence. You still deserve to have a good defense mounted on your own behalf. You still need to treat yourself as if you're someone, and someone worthy of love, even though you have all the reasons to know why you fall short.
Helen and I were
That's
both
absolutely
good
crucial, and it is hard for
candidates.
people to learn that. Hard for them to learn
Experiments.
not to beat themselves up too much.
Then why doesn't anyone ever get away with anything? That's one of your lines.
Well, I think, imagine you have a plastic ruler, and you pull it back on your face, and you let go. It's like, you think, well, this is going pretty well so far. Yeah, well, it's because you can't bend the structure of reality. This is why, and this is, I think, also part of what in this is frightening, is everything that you distort snaps back and often magnified, and everyone knows that. One of the things think about how you talk to people you're trying to treat properly. You don't say to them, okay, here, kid, here's the way you deal with life. This is, you put your son on your knee and say, look, lie every chance you get. Falsify things. Don't take any responsibility for anything. If you can slough it off to someone else, if you can hide things where no one will find them, that's a hell of a good strategy. Like, no one believes that, ever. So we know that doesn't work. Now, we're tempted because now and then you think, well, I can just cut a corner here, or
We're
I can get
going
away
back
with this
home.
and no one will find out. It's like,
Of course
Yeah,
we
they will.
are.
they'll find out.
Started
or you'll
there,
find out.
and
And I saw
it's
this in my clinical practice all the time. People would
Never gone away.
be suffering for some consequence a lot, and we'd untangle it. Maybe we'd go back 5 years or 10 years, and it would be something that was left undone, something that was done that shouldn't have been done. And sometimes not even on the part of the person, sometimes on the part of their parents, or maybe even on the part of their grandparents. Like, these things stick around for a very long period of time. But it's like, if you produce a rift in the structure of reality, it's not going to go away until you rectify it. And often it breeds more demons, that's for sure.
Well, if that's the case, why is it so hard for us to tell the truth? What is it biologically in us? And what I like to push you on these biologic issues because you're a psychologist. You actually understand how the brain works and how, in fact, the fundamental order versus chaos issue is in part reflected in our brain. So all these balancing acts our brain's pretty good at, yet truth is hard for us.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's hard to confront things now when you could hypothetically get them off. It's discounted a bit. You know, a child who's called onto the carpet for their actions is likely to think, well, if I lie about this, I'm not going to get punished for it now. I can get it later. And they might not even really believe that, but they don't want to face the consequences of their actions right here and now. Well, we can just put it off a little bit. Well, it'd be nice if you could do that. And so you're tempted to do it. You can shunt it off into the future. That's just future you, you know. You don't want to be that guy.
No, you don't.
Yeah, but it's better. It's better to have the fight now. It's better to confront it now if you can manage it.
You touched earlier on this issue of the evil within us.
Yeah.
And you use stories a lot. And some of them are stories that all of us are familiar with, Harry Potter being a good one for this example, where there's a little bit of evil in Harry Potter.
Yeah, darkness.
Darkness, the shadow.
Yeah.
Right, Voldemort.
Yeah,
story.
right.
What is it about having or respecting that we all have evil that you find is important?
There's gotta be a
for
way
us
to rotate
living
these
our
tracks.
lives?
Well, I think the capacity for evil is something that is not as distinguishable from strength. You know, I mean, my knowledge runs out at this level. The world seems to be structured so that we can act for the good. And I think that's associated with self-consciousness. I think that's illustrated in this story. Become self-conscious. The scales are all. They realize that they're naked. And to realize that you're naked is to understand your vulnerability. That's when they clothe themselves. Oh no, I'm naked. I can be hurt. Okay, I can be hurt. I have to clothe myself. I have to protect myself in the future. You actually become aware of that in a way that animals aren't. Well, what does it mean that you're naked? It means that everyone else is too. What does it mean that you can be hurt? It means that everyone else can be hurt too. It means that you could hurt them. And that's why the knowledge of good and evil goes along with the knowledge of nakedness. That took me a long time to figure out. It took me about 30 years to figure that out. Why are those two things conjoined? Oh yes. When you understand that you're vulnerable, you understand that everyone else is vulnerable, and then you have the option of exploiting that. And so that's what transforms human beings to some degree from animals, because a predator just eats you, but a human being can play with you and will for all sorts of reasons. Now, the capacity to do that.
It won't rotate.
Why is the capacity to do that?
Something's blocking it.
Let's say useful. Well, it's useful to be strong and not to have to use it. That reflects something that we talked about earlier, because it makes you formidable. And I think that you have to be formidable in order to move forward in the world, even to get through obstacles that aren't just to get through obstacles. You have to have some strength of character. You have to have some commitment. Some of that is there will be a cost if you interfere. It'll be the minimal cost necessary. Let's say if you've got yourself under control, it will be the minimal cost necessary. But do not and I don't believe if that's not built into your character, then you have no strength, and you certainly have no strength when you're pushed by someone who's malevolent. A bully, if you're like that, if the bully pushes you, and your response is, there will be a cost for pushing me, and you will pay it, then the bully will go elsewhere. And we know that too from studies of bullies. You know, like childhood bullies. They push around kids, and then they find the ones that retreat and withdraw, and they bully them. So, you know, you might think, well, usually children are bullied because of some abnormality. That's it's like there's a guy named Dan Olberg, a very smart Norwegian psychologist.
There's gotta be a way to rotate these tracks. Maybe there's a control panel nearby.
His analysis indicated that at least 3/4 of children have some obvious abnormality that could be the focus of bullying attention. It might even be your name. It doesn't take much of a genius bully to come up with a good way of making fun of your name. Or you're too tall, or you're too short, or your brother's too tall or too short, or there's something. It isn't the abnormality that is the cause of the bullying. It's the abnormality might become the focus of the bullying, but part of the cause is the withdrawal in the face of the bullies, because the bully thinks he can get away with it. Well, if you're, and it's also the case with children who are preyed upon by adult predators. Like adult predators of children look for children who are easily cowed and who won't put up a fight. So, for example, if you're teaching your children to be terrified of strangers, that's really not a very good strategy. You want kids who are confident and who will make a noise if someone messes about with them, and who are, and so that characterological strength has to be built in.
Let me play to that the evil side of that equation. We do a lot of shows on true crime through the lens of a doctor. I'm interested in the forensics and what went down emotionally, psychologically. What creates evil? What is the nature of evil? I mean, Solzhenitsyn wrote about this after unbelievable evil that he witnessed and lived through in Soviet Russia. So some people see it and can react and respond, and they survive. Others wilt away. What caused the evil?
There are levels. Well, some of it's like moronic evil, you might say. It's like, well, someone has something you don't and you want it. That's just theft, bicycle theft or something like that. It's pure material greed. And then I guess the level after that would be something like, well, the desire to cause harm because you're vengeful. And that's where the idea that you're a victim starts to play a real role. If you're a victim and things are unfair, then it's okay for you to react and to lash out and to hurt. And so then there's the conscious desire to actually produce suffering, and then that can just expand beyond anyone's imagination until what you're trying to do is take, I think, like that maximizes out when you're trying to take revenge against God for the structure of reality itself. And I think that's the way to do it. So when people, and you see approximations of this with the high school shooters and people like that, especially the guy who shot up the elementary school.
Sandy Hook.
Yeah, you bet. You gotta go to a pretty damn dark place before you think that the right thing to do with your life is to make people fundamentally identifiable because of their innocence and lack of wrongdoing, the target of your vengeful hatred. You've gone somewhere unbelievably dark to get there, but that's not the darkest place you can go. It's certainly a suburb of the darkest place you can go. You know, you can go to where Hitler went and try to cook up a strategy for destroying everything. You know, I mean, everyone says, well, Hitler was trying to dominate the world. It's like, well, maybe Hitler was trying to set up a particular dramatic flame or suicide with European flames. That's what he did.
I mean, you've mentioned totalitarian governments, Nazis in particular, several times. One of the knocks on you is that Nazis come to your rallies.
Oh, yes, it's such complete, utter nonsense. It's absolutely reprehensible.
Why do they come to your rallies? What
They
are
don't.
looking for?
There's no evidence for that at all. The alt-right folks don't like me at all. There's lots of documentation. They don't like me because I don't like politics. And I don't care if they're on the left or the right. You know, the left says, here's the victimized groups, and our society is basically an oppressor-oppressed society, and we should do everything we can to lift up the oppressed. And I don't know what we're doing with the oppressors, but I don't imagine it's pleasant. And the identity politics types on the right say, oh yes, we should play identity politics, but we'll be white ethno-nationalists, white superiority, or white ethno-state. It's like, as far as I'm concerned, none of that's even vaguely, it's reprehensible. It's thoroughly reprehensible on all fronts. The reason that this all came about, there's complicated reasons, but because I'm not a fan of the collectivist left, it's been in the interest of people who push that document to paint me as the most radical of the components, which of course would put me in the far right camp. But just because you're no fan of people who play identity politics doesn't mean you're part of the alt-right. So that's been a strategy, I think, that's been, what would you say, put into play against me for a variety of reasons that has been somewhat successful, but not very in the final analysis.
And maybe it's the wrong axis to put you on, but if 0 is ultra liberal and 100 is the ultra conservative, alt-right, where are you on that spectrum? You think of yourself as more conservative, more liberal? I know that in your life you've changed.
Well, I'm a traditionalist in many senses, you know, but I'm a very creative person, so it's very difficult temperamentally for me to place myself on the political spectrum. It's not like I don't think that the dispossessed deserve a political voice. You know, that's why I was interested in socialist politics when I was a kid, and I understand perfectly well that hierarchies dispossess and that something has to be done about that. But I also think that we mess with fundamental social structures at our great peril. I think we've destabilized marriage very badly, and that's not been good for people, especially not good for children. But I don't think it's been good for adult men and women either. And I certainly, as a social scientist, one of the things you learn if you're a social scientist and you're well educated and informed is that if you take a complex system, let's imagine you have a complex system and you have a hypothesis about how to intervene so that it will improve. Okay, so what will you learn? You'll learn once you implement the intervention that you didn't understand the system and that your stupid intervention did a bunch of things you didn't expect it to, many of which ran counter to your original intent. And you will inevitably learn that. So I learned that. I had a whole series of very wise mentors who insisted to everyone they talked to who was interested in public policy, for example, that when they put in place a well-meaning public policy initiative, that they put aside a substantial proportion of the budget to evaluate the outcome of the initiative, because the probability that the initiative would produce the results desired was virtually zero. And I believe that that's technically true. And so that tilts me in the conservative direction, because I think, well, that's sort of working, that system. And I'm also not a utopian. So I don't expect systems to work perfectly. If they're not degenerating into absolute tyranny, I tend to think they're doing quite well. Because if you look worldwide and you look at the entire course of human history, degeneration into abject tyranny is the norm. And so if you see systems like our systems, say in the democratic Western world, that are struggling by not too badly, it's like you should be in awe of those structures because they're so difficult to produce and so unlikely. And then I think, well, you take a system that's working not too badly. You think, well, I'm going to radically improve it. It's like, no, you're not. You're not going to radically improve it. You might be able to improve it incrementally if you devoted a large part of your entire life to it and you were very humble about your methods and your ambition. But if you think that some careless tweak of this complex system as a consequence of the ideological presuppositions you learned in 3 weeks in your social justice class at university, and that's going to produce a radical movement, it's like you can't even begin to fathom the depths of your ignorance.
You mentioned marriage as an example of this. As a social psychologist, what happened to marriage?
Well, I think a bunch of things happened. I mean, one thing that happened might be that we live a lot longer than we did. So the problem of having a relationship that extends over decades is a different problem than having the problem of having a relationship that extends over the period of time where you might have kids. So I think there's that. I think that women have been more autonomous, and so they've been able to transcend their more limited roles. Those roles, by the way, weren't imposed upon them by patriarchal men. I think that's a reprehensible view of history, because I think men and women fundamentally served as mutually sustaining partners throughout the course of history, despite experience in different areas of life. Women were relegated to a more restricted role because they lacked sanitation, they lacked tampons, they lacked birth control. And those problems have been solved in the last 100 years, essentially, since about 1895. And so that's freed women to participate in a much broader sense than they were able to before. But we don't want to underestimate the power of those technological revolutions, even though they sound rather mundane. They're not mundane at all, especially not the birth control pill. That's put a certain amount of stress on marriage because the traditional roles have been expanded. And you might think, well, that's great. It's like, yeah, it is. It is great in that a broader range of people have access to the expression of a fuller range of their talents. And in principle, that's good for them, and definitely it's good for the rest of society. Because because now we have access to the genius of women, let's say, too. But that's made negotiating the marital role more difficult. And then the other thing that's happened, as far as I'm concerned, is that we got a little too careless about liberalizing the divorce laws and changing the structure of marriage in general. I don't think that that was good for people, especially not for children. Because the evidence that children do better in intact two-parent families is overwhelming. No credible that I know of disputes that. So it might be because the minimal viable social structure is the minimal two values, but it's a minimum, especially. And I think the reason for that is, this is how I look at it. Everybody has lots of flaws and tilts towards insanity in at least one direction. And so partly what you want to do is you want to link up with someone over the long run, because they might be sane where you're not, and vice versa. So if you have a partner and you put yourself together, and this is also how marriage works symbolically, by the way. It's the reunion of the original man before the separation into man and woman. You put yourself together. You have one person who's basically sane. And so that maximizes the probability that you'll do reasonably well throughout your life course. But it also makes the pair of you, especially if you're communicating, sufficiently sane so that you're a foundation for the raising of children who will be socially competent and acceptable. Because if they have parents, if they have a parental unit, let's say, that's communicating and that's straightening each other out, then the child can adapt to that unit as a microcosm of broader society. And so if the child can figure out how to get along with the parents in the best possible sense, then they're also simultaneously figuring out how to get along with everyone else. So, and I think if you go below that pairing, things fragment in a way that can't be easily rectified.
I notice you're getting emotional talking about some parts of this discussion, in part when you talk about meaning and responsibility. I don't know if that touches you more personally than others, or...
Well, I think it's a consequence, actually, of many of the things that I've experienced over the last, especially the last 6 or 7 months. So, I meet 150 people or so at each of these events, personally, and many of them have stories to tell me, and they tell me overwhelming stories. And that has a cumulative effect on you. So one kid, for example, he was in his early 20s, I would say. He came up to me and he said, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but a year and a half ago, I just got out of jail and I was homeless. I started watching your lectures. He said, I'm married, I have a daughter, and I just bought my first apartment. It's like, good work. And I was in LA and I was outside the Orpheum Theater. It's kind of rough in downtown LA, and I was walking down the street with my wife. And this car pulled up beside us, and this kid hopped out, Latino kid, about 19 or so, and he said, are you Dr. Peterson? I said, yes. He said, oh, I'm really happy to meet you. And he shook my hand. He said, and I've been watching your lectures, and just wait a minute. And I said, okay. And then he ran back to his car, and he got his dad out. And they came over, and...
Sudden Stop hits theaters tonight. Can't believe I'm missing an Alex Casey movie for this.
He had his own... They had their arms around each other,
items.
and they were just smiling away,
All of them?
like with a real
Wow, you have a
Duchenne
gift,
smile,
man.
a real smile.
But those
And he
weren't
said,
all of the
"Been
alternate
watching your
items missing
lectures,
from the
and
Panopticon.
I've really been
The hiss must
working
be
on
making them restless.
putting my
We've had
relationship with my
several more
father together,
containment breaches.
and it's really
How many
worked.
of these things did he
And
lose?
so I thought,
How
well,
many?
that's a lovely thing to have happen.
Just a couple.
When you're
Should
walking
be no
through
problem for you.
a rough
I really
neighborhood, is that
appreciate
some
your
kid
help.
jumps out of
Really,
his car
just
and comes
super.
rushing over and tells him how much better his life is because he's been working hard on the basis of your recommendation.
I'll see you later,
to
Langston.
fix his
I'll be
relationship
here,
with his
like
father.
always.
And people are telling me stories like this all the time. And the thing that's sad about it, I think, and this is what makes me emotional, is not only that this is so good, and good at a level that transcends politics, absolutely, but that people require so little encouragement. You know, there's so many people I see in my lectures, and I have a very diverse range of people who come to my lectures. They're starving for encouragement. And they don't need much. I said, I had this kid talk to me at a barbecue I was at this weekend, and he's working with delinquent kids, 13 and 14 years old. And he said they were pulled out of other delinquent camps and brought to his camp, which was for the worst delinquents. And he started talking to them about my lectures. And so they've been watching him, and now they have a little fan club that's based around my lectures, and they're doing things like talking to each other about making their beds and cleaning up their rooms. It's like, it's unbelievable how little genuine encouragement many people need, and how they had none. No one ever said to them, and meant it, it's not okay for you to be a weak loser. It's not okay. And the reason it's not okay is because you could be way more than that. And it's a crime, an ethical crime, for you to allow all that necessary potential to go to waste. It hurts you, it hurts your family, it hurts the world. Really, really, it does. And people think, oh, okay, I get it. And they do get it, because they know at some level. The other thing people tell me, they say, well, I've been paying attention to your lectures, adopting a vision for my life, trying to tell the truth, trying to adopt my responsibility. Things are way better. But the other students, you've been able to help them get into words things that always seem to be true, didn't know how to say, which is a good role for you to play. And so, that's why this all makes me emotional. It's so good. And so much of this has been covered as if it's political. It's not political. It's not political. It's something that politics is nested inside. Politics is nested inside the healthy sovereignty of the individual. I'm working to buttress and sustain the healthy sovereignty of the individual. The great idea of the West. So,
is it worth it? The pain that you must feel with some of the biting criticism that you witness here about yourself. Is it worth it?
Oh, absolutely. And absolutely. And, I'm not so naive as to think you can get the good without the bad. I've had discussions with my publicists, say, and the people who are working on my book. And sometimes the discussions are such that, well, maybe a little less controversy would be a good thing. It's like, it's hard to say what's a good thing. And what's happened to me over the past 2 years, fortunately, is that every time I've been attacked, the net outcome has been in my favor. Even though it's very painful in the immediate, well, when it's happening with the mobs of students, for example, or with particularly reprehensible press piece, some of the press pieces, people who were very close to me told me they thought they sunk me. And I watch people respond to these things, and very frequently now, if someone's mobbed in social media, they apologize. They're done with one episode. And this has probably happened to me 100 times in the last 2 years. So it's very stressful. But I'm kind of detached from it, because we'll see how it plays out. And you can't do difficult things without them being difficult. And so I don't feel that it's been, what do we say, how to say it exactly. I'm perfectly satisfied with the way things are going, especially with these lectures, because they're so positive.
So how do you want to be remembered years from now when the world looks back on what
that he wanted the best for people, not the worst. And the reason I want the best for people is because I know a fair bit about what the world is like. And I definitely don't want that. And that's a conscious decision to turn away from that. It's like, enough hell. That's the lesson of the 20th century. And so it means that we take responsibility for that. We put the world together, And we start with ourselves. We do that by adopting responsibility, not by fixing someone else, and not even by fixing social structures. They're not that easy to fix. It's like start with yourself. You're a fixer-upper now. You got work to do. Get at it. Then maybe you'll develop enough wisdom so that you'll be good for someone other than you. And then you can expand that outward. So I would like the best for people.
I think when people look back on you, they'll also see that you began to tie together seemingly disparate parts of who we are as a species. And I'd like to get into that because it's deep stuff, but you articulate it in a way that I think people will understand. Let's start with the soul. This idea that we have something that for most people is this amorphous part of us. But you argue that it was in our parents, that it's out through all of us. It's a much bigger concept than I had heard.
Yeah, well, I think, this is how I think reality lays itself out. I think we all know this. You're not driven by your past like a clock. You're not deterministic. You are to some degree because you're limited. You're a limited creature. You've got rules that you run by and all of that. You know, you're not omniscient. But you're not driven by the past. What you do instead is confront the potential of the future. That's what's in front of you. So it's a domain with multiple pathways, and that's what's always in front of you. You could go there, you could go there, you could go there. There's an array of choices that confront you. You confront that as soon as you wake up and become conscious in the morning. And then there's all this potential that's there in front of you. And you use your ethical choice to determine which of those possibilities will become actual. And it's through that mechanism that you participate in the creation of reality. And that's
God, the
the
only thing
making of
creepier
you
than
in
one
the image
mannequin
of
is a
God.
few dozen
That's
of the
what
damn
God did at
things.
the beginning of time, according to our old stories, right? Spoke and transformed potential into the being that was good. And that was dependent on using truthful speech. So that's what you do if you act properly, is you confront potential and you translate it into reality. And it's your soul that does that.
Your soul makes that translation. But the soul for you is bigger than just in me, right? It's a part of, almost like our collective unconsciousness touches all of us. Our soul seems to be bigger than just what's inside of us. It's
Well, it's
connected.
also the thing that's the same between us in some sense, right? I mean, it's a funny thing because you're a singular being possessed of this creative consciousness, but so am I. So it's a strange kind of singularity because we share it, and it's the thing that unites us in some sense as sovereign individuals.
So how does faith play a role in all this? And faith, again, is, I gather that if you act appropriately, you'll have a better life. Good stuff will happen to you. Is that what faith is?
I think you make a decision about what your fundamental attitude towards being is going to be. I think that's faith. It's like, well, are things bad or good? It's like, there's a lot of evidence they're bad. There's a lot of evidence they're good. Where are you going to come down on that? Should you work to make things better? Should you work for their annihilation? These are decisions that you make, and I think they're fundamentally based on something like faith. Your decision to confront the unknown and the things that frighten you. It's like, well, do you have faith in your potential? Do you have faith in what you could call forward out of you? Because you need that in order to move forward. So you want to instill faith. I mean, we know this. If you're trying to raise a child, you want to instill faith in them. Now, you might not say, well, I'm instilling faith in God. It's like, well, it's not so easy to decide when you're doing that. But to instill in your child the faith in the ability of their own potential to unfold in a positive direction, well, that's faith. That's what you want for someone who's confident. It's like, yes, in absence of evidence, in the absence of certain evidence, I believe that my commitment to this path of action will bear fruit.
So let's take this discussion and I think make it practical. So one of the biggest battles that I sense in America, North America, so through the West, is that between religion and in many ways this is a fracture that you say Nietzsche was not as a good thing. It led to led to the totalitarian ideology. Let's look at right to today in North America. And our brain is hardwired. Religion made it possible to have inquisitive minds that led to science. Religion also placed in all of us this belief that there's some divinity in us.
Yeah.
That's in all of us. And we very thoughtfully speak about how science talks about what is. How can people watch this right now because hear us and technology is remarkable. But religion's not really science.
So what should be?
So
there has to be something beyond that. I believe that the description you done of human consciousness is actually scientifically accurate. I think that we do confront potential and that we do cast it into reality. I think if you understand how the brain works, from its ability to first grapple with what's unknown in physical representation and then to represent it in image and then to represent it in word, I think that what you see is the processed potential coming into reality. So I don't think that there's anything that's not commensurate with the scientific viewpoint there. I also think that if we act as if we're each divine centers of consciousness of that sort, then we treat ourselves properly. Well, you've got some. We treat other people properly because I'm duty bound to treat you as if you have some intrinsic value. We build social structures on that predicate, they work. So the idea that the individual is sovereign in some divine sense, if you act that out politically, it's like, hey, your society functions and people don't starve and things aren't an absolute abject tyranny. And your rulers have something to bow to, that principle of intrinsic sovereignty. Now the question is how that might be related to some metaphysical reality, because that's the question of God. And the way I don't know exactly how to answer that, except that I've seen this relationship, say, between the opening statements in Genesis, which describe God as this being that uses communicative intent to call forth being out of possibility, and that's the essence of God as portrayed in Genesis, and that's built into us as an image. Think, okay, well, that's what our whole society is predicated on, and that works. So it seems to me that there's something true about that. I don't know what the fundamental relationship is between consciousness and the soul and the metaphysics of being, but I'm certainly unwilling to assume that this is all meaningless and random. I don't believe that. I don't think that's a good theory. I don't think it works at all when you act it out. So there's something wrong with it. And I don't think there's any evidence that it's true. So people say, well, do you believe in God? And I think a bunch of things when I'm asked that question. It's like, why are you asking? What do you mean God? What do you believe? It's like, then those are reasonable objections for a question. But I think a better answer is, I act as if God exists. You say, well, does that mean you believe? It's like, well, what you believe is most appropriately expressed in your action. So, and I think, what's the saying? By their fruits you will know them. That's an action-oriented idea. It's like, so that's enough belief to stake my existence on. That doesn't mean I'm certain of it. How could you be certain of it? It's not within the human, it's not within the realm of human capacity to be certain about such a thing. And so you have to stake something on it. It's like, I act as if it's true. That's as good as I can manage. And I don't think there's a more appropriate answer than that. It's like, it's up to you to take it from there in some sense.
I think part of the reason that you've become so popular is because you take religion and you allow us to see the fundamental grammar that is offered by different religions without people having to first make the very important step of deciding whether they believe or not. I know for a lot of people listening there, that's going to be a bit of a struggle, but it is one of the more rewarding aspects of reading or listening to you. And I do think that a lot of people will come to either a conclusion you just offered, which is I can live my life that way, and the fruits of my action will be bestowed on my family and my life. And many will just decide to believe, period, because it makes sense, because there's
Yeah.
so much wisdom in these writings, no matter
Right.
what religion it is. And I've talked to folks in every discipline about how they feel about what you're saying, and most find a way into it.
Yeah.
But the reality that there is wisdom out there beyond what a scientist like me can offer. And like you, I look at the brain, I see the left hemisphere is pretty good at some types of processing, the right hemisphere is different, and one is better about things of order,
New bureau
and one's better
policy.
about things of chaos.
No more mannequins.
You know, making sense of what just happened, paying attention to things that are unexpected. The other one's pretty good at just automating my life.
Yep.
And I start to see that much of my behavior is hardwired, more than I would have normally anticipated or expected. And I suspect that when you read some of this wisdom, I've stopped thinking about people who wrote these beautiful old treatises as, you know, like many scientists think about them, as, you know, simpletons who didn't really
Yeah.
understand how the stars and the planets work, and this is their best effort at it.
Yeah.
They were trying to answer a very different
Yes,
question.
yes, they're not superstitious scientific theories. They're something different. Well, and the thing about belief, I think you put your finger on it is, well, do you follow the story? That's a fundamental religious question. You know, when people go to see a movie like Pinocchio, which is a movie I've taken apart online in some detail, it's like they suspend disbelief. No one thinks that a wooden puppet has become alive. No one questions why the wooden puppet should rescue his father from the chaos of the whale. It all just makes sense. It's like, well, yeah, but why does it make sense exactly? And isn't it interesting to notice that it makes sense? And these stories have a pattern, and the pattern has a function, and that's a religious function. You say, well, I don't know whether I believe. It's like, well, you follow the story. The Harry Potter books are a good example of that, because they have a deeply, deeply religious substructure. And that's why they were so insanely popular. You know, they have to speak for a book to become that popular. It has to speak to something that's in everyone, because otherwise, why would they become that popular? You know, and in the second volume, Harry confronts the basilisk, the thing that turns you to stone, that lurks underneath the magic castle. It's like, well, that's life, that's Jaws. It's the same story. It's like we have a structure. It's kind of magical. We live inside it. It's a hierarchy. But underneath, there's chaos and terror. And that can come up at any time and paralyze you with its gaze, right? Turn you to stone because it's so awful. And every building is like that. And so what do you have to do is you have to go down into the depths and confront that thing voluntarily. And then you find, and you'll find what's of great value in that pursuit and be reborn. It's like, well, that's the Harry Potter story. That's the second volume. It's like, well, everyone knows that story. Do you believe it? Well, do you act it out? That's the question. Do you act it out? It's the right pattern. I think, and maybe it's not even the right pattern. Maybe the human race is a hopeless race, and there's no destination for us. But for better or worse, that's our pattern. Our pattern is the snakes are after us. Well, we can cower in our dens, or we can go out and we can find the source of the snakes, and we can contend with it. And that's what we decided to do. God only knows how long ago, millions of years. We decided we weren't going to cower in our dens. We were going to go out and root out the snakes, like St. Patrick, St. George. And then we found, well, there was the snakes that were eaten. And then there were the snakes that were in other people's hearts. And then there were the snakes that were in your hearts. And all those had to be contended with. And that's part of it. That's part of even deeper mythology. Like there's an association in Christianity between of Eden and Satan. It's like, where did that come from? What kind of crazy idea is that? Well, I just laid out the idea. It's like there's always a snake. What's the worst possible snake? Well, it isn't an actual snake. It's a metaphorical snake. It's the snake that's in the heart of your enemy when he comes to burn down your city. Well, what if you get rid of your enemies? Well, the snake's still there. Well, then it's in your heart. So what's the ultimate battle? The ultimate battle is with the snake in your heart. It's like, yes, true, metaphorically, but more than that, metaphysically. As true as anything can be. That statement is as true as anything can be.
We live in a society where the dividing line between good and evil is between my tribe and someone else's tribe.
Right.
And
Yes.
maybe it's inside each and every one of our hearts.
Yes, well, that's Solzhenitsyn's comment, right? That's his conclusion from the analysis of the Gulag Archipelago. It's like, constrain the evil within. That's your primary moral obligation. That's why I don't like identity politics. It's like, it's not my tribe and your tribe. Don't be thinking that. That's a mistake. It's more sophisticated than that. You have to understand it as a spiritual battle, not as an economic battle, not as a physical battle. You have to conceptualize it as a spiritual battle. That abstracts it, that puts it up into the level of abstraction where it's properly dealt with, because otherwise it degenerates into tribal violence.
Right, so to take that abstract and reduce it to practice, religions are able to provide a grammar. Science has provided a grammar for some as well, but religion provides the basic building blocks for a lot of folks. What do you say about the argument that God is dead?
Look out for what will replace him. That's the thing. This is why I'm such an admirer of Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, both of them in particular. Because Nietzsche famously announced in the late 1800s that God was dead, but it was also, that wasn't the announcement. The announcement was, God is dead and we have killed him and we'll never find enough water to wash away the blood. And he thought everything would fall because that foundation piece had been torn away. And I believe that. So I'm trying to find out, well, what is that foundation piece? See, now Carl Jung, the great psychoanalyst, was a student of Nietzsche. Nietzsche thought that human beings would have to create their own values in the aftermath of the death of God. And there's a utopian idea associated with that Dostoevsky, that wasn't an idea that he would allow. He didn't believe that human beings could do that. Jung, following Freud, discovered that, let's say, that you can't create your own values because you are a certain sort of being. You have a nature. And the best you can do is to run with it, rediscover the value. And that's the same as the revivification. It's the same thing. It's the rescuing of the fallen from the belly. It's the same thing with Pinocchio. And it's an eternal return to the depths and reclamation of the relationship with the divine spirit, let's say. And that's religious or metaphysical language, but I mean it most concretely in the sense that I discussed. It's like, that's your ability to turn it into reality. It's your fundamental responsibility. It's actually what you do as a living, self-conscious being. And we elevate that to the highest value. Say, that's divine. It's like, yes, that's divine. Well, how is that related to the transcendent divine? I don't know, but it seems related to it. I also think that that's a perfectly reasonable claim. And there's all sorts of experiences that people have under all sorts of different conditions that seem to indicate some relationship between their isolated consciousness and being as such. It's outside of our grasp for some reason, but that doesn't mean it's not there. It doesn't mean that people haven't reported on it.
So one thing that you've raised to my consciousness is whether we would even have a civilization if we were unable to believe in things bigger than us. So I'm of Turkish origin, and I went back to Turkey this summer, in part because I was visiting the Syrian refugees, but within an hour drive of this refugee camp was the oldest civilization known to mankind. It's called Göbekli Tepe. The literal translation is Potbelly Hill. It's 12,000 years old, 3 times older than the pyramids, 4 times older than Stonehenge. And they had big sculptures. And the reason I was stunned by it is I was always taught in school, I don't know what you learned, but you're in a farming community, you probably had some discussion of how farming came about. But I learned farming happened, and then because of that we had free time. We sent off a couple people to be religious leaders. They went off and wrote all the religious tomes, and that's how civilization evolved. But Göbekli Tepe didn't have an agricultural community. It was a hunter-gatherer community, which meant that hunter-gatherers were able to build temples to their gods. And because they could believe in things bigger than themselves, they began to think they can control the world around themselves. So follow this, is important.
Yep.
Agriculture came because of a belief in deities, not the opposite.
Right.
Completely flips everything in my that I had ever
Well,
learned.
if you're a hunter, the question is, what should you hunt? See, and we're built on a hunting platform, human beings, because we can throw and aim. So then the question is, once your brain starts to develop, is, okay, what's the ultimate aim? Right? And you might think, well, it's to hunt. It's like, no, it's to provision. Okay, so how do you provision? By aiming at transcendent things. Because then everyone is watching, it's everyone shares, we all work together. And we get rid of hunger as such. Instead of aiming at a particular animal, we aim at something higher, and it works. And so that's encapsulated in our narratives. And then the aim issue is really fundamental to that. Like, what's at the center? What's the point that we're aiming at? And that's the ultimate point. It's the highest possible aim. It's even in our language. And everything we do has to do with aim. It shows you how deeply the idea of hunting is in us. Carnivorous chimpanzees, fundamentally.
Use the word sin.
That's right.
Sin is to miss your target.
Miss your target. Yeah, it's an archery term, hamartia. It means to miss the mark. Yeah, that's a really useful thing to know. It's like, well, what's a sin? Well, it's when you miss your target. Well, how do you miss your target? How about you don't aim? How about you don't know how to aim? How about you refuse to aim? How about you have no aim? And no one can live under those conditions. We need an aim. It orients us. It gives us direction. It gives our life meaning. It's like literally. It does that neurologically.
So that begs the question, without culture, 70,000 years ago, we believe humans started the diaspora from northern Africa. At least 12,000 years ago, you have Göbekli Tepe. Abraham, by the way, was born there. Not surprisingly, a lot of Christ's disciples were in that area. I mean, you start to begin to realize that there's lots of layers of culture that got us to where we got. And if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying there's a collective unconscious that senses thousands of years of human evolution, and that culture cannot be discarded. If you throw that culture, that faith away, those traditions, even if you're not quite sure why they exist, you toss them away and you discard them, there will be consequences.
Okay, so the first thing is that some of the best scientists that I knew, like Jaak Panksepp, who was a great neuroscientist who studied emotion. I think he was probably one of the 5 greatest scientists of emotion. He was really interested in archetypal ideas. The people who study the emotional and motivational systems in the brain are the ones that are most convinced about the reality of archetypal issues. So, for example...
So again, so the people who understand how our brains work...
The emotion and motivational systems, the deep layers, not the cortical tissue.
Reptilian.
Yeah.
They're convinced that these archetypes are vital.
Yeah, well, not all of them, but many of them.
Explain what an archetype is.
An archetype, say, well, it's a behavioral pattern. That's what it would be most fundamental, a behavioral proclivity. And then the secondary archetype is a reflection of that in the story. So let's say one of our behavioral proclivities is to react in a certain way to a predator. So how do you react to a predator? 2 ways. Terror, freezing, to be turned to stone when you look at the Medusa. That's the response of a prey animal to a predator. That's archetypal. It's wired into us. It happens way before you think, way faster than you can think. But then that's secondarily reflected in a story, and that story becomes abstracted. So the ground of the archetype would be the biology, and then the secondary manifestation would be the manifestation of that biology in action.
The archetypes are the most important thing. Yeah, because if they weren't important, we wouldn't be hardwired to react to them.
That's right. That's exactly right. So
some of these archetypes aren't running away from it. They're also respecting their parents.
Yes,
right?
Well, you better respect your parents when you die. I mean, you have been dependent on your parents for 18 years. Like, yeah, there's filial respect built in. Now, it's pliable because sometimes you have parents that disrespect them, you die. So there has to be some plasticity. But as a fundamental rule of thumb, it's there as a pattern. And I guess an archetype would also be something like the proclivity to learn language. No one really understands that, but it's obviously built into us. Even children who are quite impaired intellectually, with the general exception of really severely autistic kids, learn to speak. It's built into our biology in a way that we really don't understand. Fear of snakes is built into our biology. For a long time, psychologists thought it was just, no, we just learned fear. And then psychologists thought, no, we learned to be afraid of some things more easily than others. So you could condition fear to pictures of spiders faster than you could condition fear to pictures of pistols, for example. But then it went farther than that. It's like, no, you're not just conditionable. You're actually innately afraid of snakes. But I don't think it's snakes. I think it's toothed reptilian predators, which is a broader category than snakes. So, and that's the dragon fundamentally, because the dragon looks like an amalgam of predatory cats, predatory birds, and predatory snakes, and maybe fire as well, which would have been an ancestral friend and enemy, right? Because fire is an ancestral friend and enemy. There's evidence, I think it was Richard Wrangham wrote a very good book on fire a while back, a very good primatologist. He figured we'd been using fire for 2 million years. something like that, and that we traded intestinal tract for brain. Once we learned to cook, and that was a secondary consequence of hunting, let's say, or at least associated with hunting, because our diet became so much more nutritious and calorie rich, especially eating meat and fat, that we could afford to shrink our digestive system and trade it in for brain. Chimps spend about 8 hours a day chewing, because mostly what they eat is leaves. It's like, go out and try to eat leaves. It's like all you're going to do is chew because they have no nutrition. So anyways, we're built on a hunting platform. We throw and aim. Even our perceptions are very aimed at something. And the metaphysical question, you see how the biology transforms itself into the abstraction. It's like, well, you have to have an aim because you're a hunter. It's like, well, what's the ultimate aim? That's the religious question. What should you hunt above all else? What should you devote your life to pursuing?
So why are these stories the best way for us to articulate these negotiated rules that we all have with each other?
Because the principles are so complex that we weren't able to articulate them and understand them. So one of the things Nietzsche pointed out was, you tend to think that morality emerges in thought and then is imposed on behavior. We think up the rules and then we apply them. It's like, no, we evolve the rules. Then we observe them in behavior. Then we tell stories about them. And then out of the stories we can abstract general principles, and then maybe we can get to the point of an articulated morality, but it's bottom up. Now, there's top-down effects, because as you articulate, you start to change your behavior, but a lot of this is moved up from the bottom. One of the things I lecture about in my public appearances is the emergence of proto-morality in animals. So here's a great example. This is from Jaak Panksepp, the scientist that I mentioned earlier. He wrote a book called Affective Neuroscience, which is a great book. He said, here's what he did. Rats like to rough and tumble play. So if you take a juvenile rat, especially the males, they'll work to enter an arena where they can wrestle with another rat. And they really like it. It's play behavior. It's not aggression. It's distinguishable from aggression. Okay, so you put your two rats together. One's 10% bigger than the other. The 10% big rat just flattens the little rat. Sure. Pins them, just like kids. Yeah. Okay. But then you see, you don't play with someone once. You play with them multiple times in life. So the game isn't one bout. The game is repeated bouts. Okay, so now you pair the rats together. So the next time you pair them together, the little rat has to ask the big rat to play. That's the rule. Then if you pair them repeatedly, if the big rat doesn't let the little rat win 30% of the time, 30 or 40% of the time, it's some substantial amount of the time, the little rat won't play with him anymore. And so Panksepp is right. Yeah. That's for sure. That's a major discovery, because it's the emergence of fair play. At the mammalian level. It's like if the big rat plays unfair because the little rat doesn't get a chance, then the little rat won't play. So then you think, well, here's the morality. And this is what you say to your kids when you say, it doesn't matter where you play, it matters how you play the game. You don't know what the hell it means. What do you mean by that? Does it matter to win? Of course it matters to win. Okay, but let's define winning. Here's the game. You can win the game. Okay, but the game isn't isolated, because there's a whole bunch of games, because it's a tournament. But then it's a tournament of tournaments, many games. So what you...
Your whole life.
Your whole life, that's right, is a sequence of games. So what do you tell your kid? Play so that you will be invited to play. Because the winner is the person who's invited to play the most games. And so what does that mean? It means, well, try to win, because you're no fun if you don't try to win. Sharpen your skills, because you're no fun if you don't try. Help your damn teammates, because it's a team effort, and you want to push them up as you put yourself up. Distribute the spoils. Don't hog all the glory, right? If you're ahead when you're playing soccer, pass the damn ball, right? Act in this admirable sportsman-like manner. Well, what's that? It's prototypical morality. So then you think, well, he's a good sport. He does this well. Well, he's a good sport over here too. Here's another person who's a good sport, and it's something different. And here's another person. And then we get a picture of what the good sport looks like, and that's the good citizen, and we start telling stories about that. But it's not like we understand, right? We can't understand. We have to build the story up from the behavior. And so if you look at these old stories, there's behavioral wisdom encoded in the stories. Here's an idea. Moses leads his people through the desert, right? And they're all fractious. They got out of a tyranny, but now they're in a damn desert. It's like out of the tyranny, out of the frying pan into the fire, right? So that's what happens. You go from a tyranny into a desert, not to the promised land, which is why people will stay in a tyranny. It's like, why do you stay in that tyranny? Well, we'd rather be here than in the desert, because that's the next place. It's okay, well, now you're in the desert. So what do? Fragment and fight over what's important. So that's what Moses faces. It's like all these Israelites, they're fighting like mad. So they come to him. It's outlined in the story. So he adjudicates their disputes, and he spends like 10,000 hours listening to all the Israelites whine about everybody and the desert and complain about God. And so this is driving Moses crazy. He's trying to figure out, well, how should these people live? And he's actually adjudicating the cases. Well, then all of a sudden he goes up on a mountain and poof, the rules appear. It's like, those are the rules by which you live. They're discoveries. It's like, oh, this is how you have to conduct yourself behaviorally in order for everyone to prosper. It's bottom up. If he wouldn't have gone out of the tyranny into the desert and done that all that adjudication, the rules wouldn't have been revealed. Or you could say, let's say you're watching a wolf pack or a troop of chimps. They have structure, behavioral structure, so that would be acting out the archetype. You're the anthropologist or the ethologist, and you're watching, or the primatologist. You think, well, it's as if the chimps are following these rules. Well, that's us. That's us. We're watching ourselves over thousands of years. It's like, okay, what are we up to? Well, here's an interesting story about how things go badly. It's like, yeah, you're extracting out the essence of the behaviors. And you turn them into a story, and the story's compelling because you want to imitate it, right? Just like a child acting out his father, or a child acting out her mother. You want to imitate it so that you get the drama down, you imitate the pattern, but then you can start to think, okay, well, there are principles that can be articulated that underlie these patterns. Oh, that's natural ethics. So and this is a wonderful thing, because it means that the natural ethic in some sense isn't just a rational construct. It's not just a floating abstraction. It's like the articulated ethic matches the image, it matches the story, and the story matches the behavior, and the behavior matches the biology, and the biology reflects the structure of being. It's just, that's the musical layering of all these layers, one on top of another.
So if we get that it's not just random chance, not just a bunch of rules, but it's actually tens of thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of years of us seeing stuff, observing stuff, and our biology matches it. What's going on today? Why do we live in a society, I think the biggest epidemic is isolation and loneliness.
Yep.
But it's manifested in a lot of disagreeable behavior. Mm-hmm. I've heard you use the word complexity management, as opposed to mental illness. Because a lot of people think I'm depressed, I'm borderline, I'm personality, I've got this issue, I have that issue. But it's actually, if I understand you correctly, something that's much more common, something much more ubiquitous, something much more understandable, that we have a complexity management problem.
Yeah, well, the doctrine of turning to face that which confronts you is a complexity management solution. It's like, what do you do when horrible things are chasing you? Turn around, chase them back. That's your best bet. And then I think that is an unbelievably ancient human decision. Well, so that's the story of that's the classic story of the dragon fight. You go out, the hero goes out to confront the dragon and rescues the virgin from her clutches. Well, what does that mean? It means that the standard human pattern of sexual attraction is for the person who decides to confront the predator in its lair to be reproductively successful. That's what that story means. It's like, well, that's worked for us. That's our fundamental story. And who knows how old that is? It's as old as predator primates. That's how old it is. Maybe it's older than that. So that's at least several million years old. But it goes back. It's like Lynn Isbell, who's an anthropologist at UCLA, she makes the case that the reason that human beings have acute vision is because we were preyed upon by predatory snakes over a 60 million year period. So we have unbelievably acute vision. And we're particularly good at seeing the kind of camouflage patterns that snakes have on their skin in the lower half of our visual system. It's like snakes gave people vision. That's Lynn Isbell's theory. And the way she established that was she went around the world and she looked at the acuity of primate vision and correlated it with the prevalence of predatory serpents.
So the more snakes, the better our vision.
Exactly.
Right.
So that's such a cool principle too, because there's a metaphysical principle there too, which is, why does reality have an adversarial nature? Why would God set something on you, say, an enemy? An adversary makes you stronger. Well, isn't that cruel? It's like, not if the person who sets the adversary on you believes that you could win. Now, maybe that's an insufficient explanation, but there's something about it that's... You know, you could think about this biologically, too. I was reading The Master and His Emissary, which is quite an interesting book about hemispheric function, and the author pointed out that if you want to make a very small movement with your right hand, the best way to do that is to put your left hand up and then to push against your right hand and to push. Opponent processing. Precision in action is a consequence of opponent processing. You have opponent processing between the right and left hemispheres. To make things function, you need this opposition between powerful forces. And I think that's built into the opposition between chaos and order that's hemispherically represented. But also something like the opposition between good and evil. Maybe you get a higher good when there's opposition between good and evil. I mean, obviously, these are ideas that are at the absolute extent of my cognitive ability to try to think them through, but maybe the good you get when good and evil are both possibilities is a higher good than the good you get with just good.
That tug of war, which you actually argue artists do brilliantly, right? They stand on the border between order and chaos, they look into chaos, they see patterns, and then they tell the people on the other side, hey, I just noticed a couple things over there, right? So if that's where we need to be, then in modern society, why is it that we can't get those two groups talking to each other? People who are primarily left-brain, you know, organized order folks, and the folks on the right side are more chaos folks. What gives?
Good question. Well, that's something I've really been struggling with in my lectures. I try to make a case for the left and the right wing. Okay, so the right wing, there's a variety of things that distinguish them, but we'll talk about one in particular. You have to accomplish useful things in the world just to survive, okay? And if you're going to do that in a social space, you do that by constructing a hierarchy. And if you construct a hierarchy, it's going to be of a certain steepness because the people at the top are going to be more successful than the people at the bottom. There's also hierarchies of productivity, so the people at the top are more productive than the people at the bottom. And those overlap to some degree. So you have to do useful things to survive. If you're going to do useful things in a social system, you have to build a hierarchy. Okay, so hierarchies are necessary and valuable. That's what the right says. The left says, yeah, wait a minute though. The hierarchy tends towards obfuscation and corruption, and it dispossesses people at the bottom.
California fires. Sorry, go ahead.
No problem. Well, and those are both true. And that's part of that opponent processing. You need the hierarchy. Social animals organize themselves by hierarchies are way older than capitalism, way older than the West. They're older than trees. They're unbelievably ancient. There's no getting rid of the hierarchy. But hierarchies tend towards corruption and dispossession.
And those are tied, by the way, with the lobster.
Yes, exactly. Yes, someone gave me this. Yeah, exactly. 350 million years of hierarchies. Now, that doesn't mean we should organize our societies on the lines of the lobsters. That's not the point. The point is that you can't attribute the existence of hierarchy to the West or to capitalism. So that's a foolish critique. That's the basic Marxist critique, is at least part of it. Okay, so the left wing says, wait a second now, the hierarchies tend towards corruption, and they dispossess people, and they need to be taken care of. Like, yes. How much should we take care of them versus how much should we sustain the hierarchy? And the answer is, we don't know, and it changes. So that's why you need political dialogue. Okay, so what's the fundamental necessity for political dialogue? Freedom of speech. So freedom of speech is the mechanism that keeps the opponent process balanced. And so you don't mess with freedom of speech, which is why I opposed the legislation that I opposed in Canada, which started all this political...
The transgender legislation. Just for 2 seconds on this.
Yeah.
So there was a law that said you must refer to transgender people the way they want you to, right? Picking the pronoun they use.
Yes, that was part of the legislation, background part of the legislation.
And do you have any problems with transgender people being identified by what pronoun they use? In private settings, in your practice, or in your classrooms?
My proclivity when people ask me to address them in a certain way is that if I believe that they're being straightforward in their communication, then I tend to accede to the demand, like a reasonable person does. So that wasn't the issue. The issue was the freedom of speech and also the government's insistence that it was all right to build a social constructionist view of gender into the law, which is now the case it's the case in New York. It's also the case in Canada. And that's not appropriate because gender is not socially constructed in its entirety. It has a biological basis. So you don't build that into the law. So, but anyways, that it was the compelled speech issue that really got me. It's like, no, you don't have sovereign control over my speech. Never in the history of English common law has the legislative branch produced legislation that compelled voluntary speech. There has been restrictions on hate speech. There's more of those in Canada than there are in the US. And I don't agree with them either. I think that's a mistake, but that's a separate issue. Compulsion in speech. Your Supreme Court deemed that invalid in 1942. No compulsion of speech in the private sphere, no matter what the reason. Exists. Who defines hate? And that's like the law. The answer is those people who want to define hate. So what we want is we want to have people say their hateful things out in the open, where you can keep an eye on them, and where they can invalidate their own viewpoint, which is generally what happens.
Invalidate their viewpoint.
Yes.
If they say something hateful, racist, for example, the society says, you guys, you're missing the boat. You're completely off point.
Right.
You're reprimanded. It's time to get back on.
Right, exactly that.
That's how it's supposed to be.
Well, that's a good way to put it. What it also means is that people who espouse those opinions for whatever reason get appropriate subject to social correction. That's good. We want them to be subjected to social correction.
So what happens if the government passes a law saying you can't say this? Then what do they do?
Underground. And psychological. And that's not good. But then you don't know what's going on. Like this thing that happened with Alex Jones. Leave Alex Jones alone. Why? You want to see what he's up to?
Not because you like him, but you want to see what he's up to.
Absolutely. You want to see what people are up to. You know, because sometimes extremists are correct. Almost never. They're almost always dangerous beyond belief, but like one time in 1,000, things have changed so radically that someone who appears extreme is correct. And that's the case. You got to keep an eye on it. You know, and it's not clear to me at all that most of the followers of Alex Jones necessarily agree. Maybe they're mildly entertained by his answers. Whatever it might be, but it was a mistake to go after him. So you got to keep an eye on it. Plus, you shouldn't persecute people who are paranoid.
That was Kissinger's big statement to Nixon, about Nixon. Even paranoid people have enemies.
Right.
Now you can confirm their bias.
Right, that's exactly right. Yes, that's not a good idea.
Why is every person watching us right now, and there are quite a few, suffering from anxiety, depression, addiction, all three together even? How is it possible we're not all there in that quandary?
Oh, well, first of all, many people are at different periods in their life. Right? It's a rare person who doesn't have a severe bout of anxiety at some point in their life, often because things collapse around them, you know, like they encounter some real catastrophe. Even with depression, if you look at the epidemiological studies, most people who eventually suffered depression had their first episode precipitated by something truly awful. So, you know, we move in and out of states of terrible negative emotion throughout our life.
Why don't we stay there? What makes us better? Almost subconsciously, we have a resilience.
Yeah, well, some of it's the grace of God and blind luck. You know, some people are just healthier than other people, and that makes a big difference. So, you know, you don't want to be too morally self-righteous about the absence of anxiety in your life. It could easily be due to your characterological strengths and your willingness to confront things voluntarily and all that, but health plays a big role. Health and good fortune. You know, I mean, you meet people now and then who are in their 40s and they've never suffered a serious loss from death, for example.
Do you think part of the reason that people find their path is because they know the story they're in?
Oh, definitely.
And some folks, they don't know what story they're in, or they're in someone else's story as a bit player, as you've articulated.
Yeah, well, we've produced some exercises online to help people get their story straight. There's one exercise called future authoring that
Speak about that. I did that actually.
Yeah. Well, you know, the idea was that it's based on exactly the questions you asked, which is, well, what's the story of your life? Is it a comedy or a tragedy? Comedy is something with a happy ending, fundamentally, and a tragedy is, well, it starts bad and gets worse. You know, and is it a tragedy that someone else is imposing on you, or some bit of you that you don't understand? What's the story of your life? Part of that is, well, what do you want? What are you aiming at? That's the reverse of sin, right?
Right.
You're aiming at something. Well, the Future Authoring Program helps you determine what it is that would be good for you to aim at.
What do you hope for?
What do you hope for? So the exercise basically assumes that you treat yourself as if you're someone that you're taking care of. So that's the presupposition. You're valuable, despite your flaws. It would be okay for you, and maybe all right for the universe as a whole, if your life wasn't any more wretched than it has to be. So we could set it up for that.
Right.
Okay, so now if you were looking 3 to 5 years down into the future, and you could have what you needed within the bounds of reason, what would it be? What do you want? What do you want from your family? What do you want from your friends? How are you going to educate yourself? What are you going to do for your career? How are you going to take care of your mental and physical health? How are you going to resist temptation? What are you going to do with your time outside of work that's productive and meaningful? You get to have it. It's like knock and the door will open. Okay, we've got to knock first. Well, and then you got to pick the door. And I really like this because you cannot catch something you're not pursuing. So now, if you're pursuing it, that doesn't mean you'll catch it. But generally, you'll catch something interesting along the way. You know, that's the thing that's so cool about this. Let's say you set out a vision, you start pursuing it, you don't get what you were after. But you learn a lot as you move towards that destination. And as you learn, your vision is going to change, and you may end up with something that's better than what you were aiming at to begin with. But that won't happen unless you initiate the journey. And that's partly something I learned from the Abrahamic stories. The story of Abraham was picked up because God calls Abraham to an adventure when he's like 85. Get out of your father's tent, for God's sake. Get out there in the world, right? Really, that's how the story is set up. Leave your family and your tent. It's time to get out in the world. Well, what do you see? Famine is the first thing, tyranny, and the potential loss of his wife. It's like Abraham must have been going. It's like the tent's looking pretty good. But it's this call to adventure. Okay, so you put together a vision, that's your call to adventure. Get out there in the world and contend with it. Well, you might not get what you want, but you might find what you need. But it won't happen without the pursuit. And that's part of faith. Right? Faith is, I'm going out in the world to seek my fortune. And if I do that properly, then the fates will cooperate with me.
How do the archetypal stories that we, in our subconscious, have? Archetypal questions are the ones that everyone really was trying to ask.
Yeah.
Even if we can't put words to it right. How do they help us maintain our sanity? And do you think that's part of the problem? That we've lost touch with ancient wisdom. Again, part of our collective unconscious that should be there, should be part of us, that we distance ourselves from, either from technology or modern culture, whatever.
Yeah. Well, look, we have the capacity for abstraction, right? And so to abstract means you can think without acting, because otherwise it's useless. It's not abstraction then.
That's got to be an altered item. this thing again. You've gotten to another altered item. What does this thing want? Is it fighting the Horde? got to be an altered item. This thing again. I've got into another altered item. What does this thing want? Is it fighting a board? I never did like flamingos. Too pink.
listening to America Overnight, celebrating 29 years shining a light. What I'm about to tell you.
There is a curious correlation with the yet unknowable forces intruding upon our world in the form of altered world events. These forces gravitate toward archetypal objects of God.
Annual evaluation of P6. Requesting in a single word, describe the world around you. Dr. Darling is out of the building today.
He's never out. Never visits us, Miss Roberts. Tell Darling it wasn't my fault. I couldn't control it yet, but I can now. I learned. Will you tell him?
In a single...
Let's see what they have on Ordinary. It's all here. Our home, our school, the woods, the dump.